Good morning, this is Will Faber from Art to Ride, and today we're going to go through an entire lesson from last week with Sandra and her horse Carra. Many of you will remember, if you've been watching this horse for a while, we've probably been working her over a year, something like that, about what I would expect to get to this point, and we have just gotten to the point with this horse where we are beginning to get decent working walk, trot, and somewhat in the canter here. So I thought I'd take you through her lesson today and show you where we're at. Now you'll notice that she is in a snaffle this morning. Many of you may remember that with this horse, because she was so explosive and kind of dangerous and she would just explode at any little sound, we rode her in a double bridle just for safety's sake, never to use the curb for flexion, just to get her attention so you could keep her from basically running off, if that makes any sense. Which is how the old masters thought about the double bridle. They thought the double bridle actually prepared the horse for the work in the snaffle. The opposite of how we think about it today. But the idea that you could communicate in a way with these kind of difficult horses, but without trying to force them into a frame. That's the problem with today. We see almost every upper level horse, the curb is constantly engaged. They're basically riding the horses off the curb as they try to force them into some kind of collection, which of course never happens that way. When we force horses in the front end, all it does is shorten their gaits. So happily to say that this one is now stretching really beautifully now, coming through in all three gaits, and is relaxed enough that we are able to get on her and start her here in the walk and get right into a stretch. And that was what you want to consider if you're thinking about, if you're bringing a horse along like this. It was a very long time that this horse did not do any riding at all. She was only doing groundwork. Her back was so weak that when you get on it, it would just collapse up from underneath you. But now, as you see here, she's strong enough to hold her up. And you'll notice even today, if she goes up and down with her head and neck, that there isn't a big difference between how the back end is coming through. Until the back is strong enough, if you take any contact or lift the head too high, the back will just collapse and it cannot come up at all. So happy to say that this horse is gaining the points that we are developing working gaits. And we call them working gaits because we really don't ride horses much on their backs until they are strong enough to be in working gaits. That's why we call it working gaits, because they're ready to actually start working and developing beyond that with the rider on their back. We get on them too soon, their backs just collapse and they never come through. Even horses that are very good movers that you see today, we're breeding horses that are these incredible movers, but the problem is they move well enough that even when they're hollow, they fool people who don't know what they're looking at. So they see this giant leg extension coming out in front. But once again, it's the back legs. When we talk about dressage, we're talking about what the back legs are doing, whether they're coming through, whether they're lifting up and lifting the horse off the ground, which of course this is what real collection is. So we can see that this horse is now developing that. She comes out very nicely into this stretch, which would have been unheard of. It's only been a few lessons here now that we've been able to get on and be able to walk her like this and go right into a stretch. And this is, of course, how we still want to work every horse, whether it's a Grand Prix or whatever its level is. They all start at that same level of just stretching out in front of them and getting a good swing in the walk. And they develop and come up much higher depending on their level of development. But the point is, it all starts at the same place every day, stretching them all the way down, letting them really begin to swing through their backs before we ask them to come up. So you can see now she's softening quite nicely. And there's a perfect example. You'll see her sometimes she'll come a little bit behind the vertical or drop a little bit too hard up in the air. She may come up a bit too much, like she's kind of trying to do there. But Sandra's able to quickly soften her and get her back into a working frame where she keeps the neck out long in front of her. But notice how soft today, when she really gets right, how soft she is in the pole, and there's no break back in the third vertebrae in the neck. And you can see there, for instance, that she's asking her to soften a little bit more through the jaw and pole. But notice there's not a big change in the step. Anytime before this, if we tried to take any contact at all, the back end would just stop moving, or the back would just drop out from underneath you and the hind legs would fall out behind. So here she's doing a little bit of shoulder fore, and she goes into that very nicely. It keeps a good rhythm. So other than her head coming up and down a little bit, which is to be expected at this point, just finding her position, her balance. But that was really quite good. Notice there really wasn't any big change in the rhythm of the horse's step, even though we had a little bit of change in what her head and neck position were doing. The rest of it was not changing. So when we get to that point, we know that the horse is really ready to begin to be ridden and be worked in the ridden gaits. Same thing here. You can see her just lifting ahead a little bit. Sandra softening her a little bit. Notice, but she keeps stepping in a good 4-beat rhythm. As she softens. You see her attention wants to go someplace else for a moment, but Sandra just keeps softening her, keep her bending away from what she's trying to look at over there. And she softens and comes pretty nicely back into the working walk rather. Very nice. That's what we're looking for. Notice we want her neck out long like that and just come up a little bit. Notice how relaxed she gets back into the stretch. Once they find the stretch and feel comfortable there, whenever they get a little uptight like she was getting there, there's horses in the pastures over in that field beyond those trees there. Come back to that stretch and we see her once again develop that nice relaxation. And then once again, as she changes directions, there's not a lot of change in the rhythm of the horse's step. The walk is so important, realizing that the walk is where we explain everything, is what Nuno Oliveira used to always say. The walk is where we explain everything to the horse. So things are coming slowly enough that they can understand. I always pretty much gauge riders by what I see them doing in the warm-up. When you see riders that go right to the trot immediately every time, or they're cantering their horses within 2 minutes of what they're doing, you know right away that they really don't know enough to be able to feel the horse into this position in the walk to avoid all of that stress that they go through. And of course, just like with any other athlete, if you've ever worked out yourself as a human, they tell you every day to stretch before and after we work, warming up your muscles correctly. Posture, how important posture is to working out. And the same thing is true of the horse. Of course, the horse's posture is on 4 legs instead of 2, but it's that same thing of understanding what correct posture is, lifting their back, bringing the withers up through those shoulders. So a horse like this that was so nervous and so overreactive, everything, just to be able to get on and walk like this is a huge achievement and will ultimately lead to everything else. Unfortunately, so many people today, when they're training their horses, they're really just tiring them out, which is, of course, usually why we see people who go immediately to trot and canter, because they're just trying to get rid of the excess energy. Well, we want to work a horse. We don't want to exhaust a horse before we then try to ask it to do something. And we see that all the time. People wearing horses out before they actually get on them. So we want them to be quite fresh, but once again, be trained well enough that they understand what it is that we want. You can see Sandra softening her into that working walk there, coming around. There's a little moment of resistance. Trying to find them. Remember, we're just now starting to bring her up into this working position from the stretch, so she's a little bit unsure of herself here. You see that softening really nicely now. And this horse is just getting to the point now where you can ride her with your hands up and together in the right position. You'll see Sandra once in a while widen her hands. Of course, we do that to keep from pulling back on the reins to not lose contact, but without taking any more contact. See you getting her off her inside leg a little bit, and so as she steps up Once again, it steps up, the back comes up. You watch the top part of the neck begin to engage rather than the underside of the neck. Always remember, when you see a horse with a thick underside of the neck, that is developed by pulling with their shoulders instead of lifting themselves and carrying themselves forward. And often you'll see horses today, these upper level horses, and you see them once they stop and they let them out of the tight frame they're holding them in, you'll see that the only part of the horse's neck that really is developed is the underside. But once you understand these principles, you can tell exactly how a horse has been trained by seeing it standing in the stall. The horse's muscling tells the whole story, and things like the position of the neck. You can see a horse that's been overflexed in the neck. When they stand there, they have a lot of strange tension lines up behind their ears there along the neck, where they're flexing back in the third or fourth vertebra instead of softening at the pole the way you see this horse doing. But remember, no horse can ever soften at the pole until its back lifts. That's why it's so important that we get this correct in the stretch and then just gradually bring the horse up in the neck as it is strong enough to maintain the trot. And we can see here for her, even once again, just like the walk works, she lifted her head up and down a little bit, but there was no real change in how she was moving her legs, and that's what we're looking for, to see how she's dropped very nicely into a working trot there for her. You can see Sandra working with her inside rein a little bit at times, trying to soften her. But that's really quite nice. There, look how nicely and consistently lit up the whole top line of this horse is. When we started this horse, her neck was like a pencil, and you can see how much it's thickened along the base there. Now you can't hear her because we've cut the sound off so that I can talk over this, but this horse was also a horse that when we first met her, when you heard her coming around the ring, she just sounded like a crowd stomping around, because she just stomped her front feet so paddled them into the ground so hard that she just pulled herself along with her front end. Now if you see her, she's very, very quiet. You don't hear that at all, or at least very rarely. Really nicely coming into the working trot there. And once we can get that, then it's once we can get the working trot and we can maintain it, we build muscle by just keeping going what we're doing. We don't have to keep slowing down and stopping. So once again, the lateral work, always remember, lateral work is to help the horse engage. Why we work so much on circles in the beginning. Every circle is a lateral work, really. We're always putting the horse a little bit in shoulder in or shoulder fore around the circle in order to engage the inside hind leg. But once we can do that, once we can get the horse to like this, then we want to just keep the horse working in that working gait in order to build muscle so that we can ultimately develop collection. And once again, remembering that collection is not a trick. Collection is nothing more than a further development of the working gait. The working gait becomes a collected trot. It is not something separate or you think of differently. It's just a higher level of the same thing. As the horse eventually can lift itself off the ground enough, lift its front into the air, that's what real collection is a degree to which the horse can lift itself from the thrust of its hind legs. It has nothing to do with shortening the stride. So many people today, when we see riding, are doing nothing more than shortening the horse's stride, which is why they have to have these $150,000 horses to do it with, because they still look like something to somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at, which I would say is most of the dressage judges in the world today, sadly. When we see that things like that horse that just won the World Cup with Patrick Kittle, here's a horse with its blue tongue hanging out and it wins the World Cup. How is that possible? Well, only in a very corrupt world, I'll tell you. Really nice there. Nicely she's softening there. And you'll notice that when she does soften, really the gait almost slows down, but it keeps that wonderful engagement. Back into the stretch again. This is the perfect example of a horse that could not have been trained any other way than this way. She had been attempted to train her numerous times, I'm sure, by the previous owners that Sandra got her from, and she had just made her into a basket case where they had just given up. But every horse can be trained and developed to an amazing level if they're sound enough to do it. Really nice there. So you come in soft and nicely, keep the upper. Now it's nice she keeps keeping her pole up right here, staying in that working position. So this is the first lesson we've really been able to go this far and just really keep her basically consistent. Obviously you see a little bit of bobble here and there. The head comes up and down a little bit. Sandra has to correct her a little bit, but nothing terrible. She's never having any moments of just complete disconnection or panic. And of course, that's what's all about, trust. You know, when horses trust you, then we can get to this point. But a horse like this had lost all trust in human beings and was just in a total state of confusion about what it was supposed to do when anybody tried to ride it. Once again, watching here. So even though the head and neck comes up a little bit there before, she did not disengage behind. We didn't see the hind legs falling out behind. Once again, into a good stretch, how important it is to keep coming back to that good and deep stretch throughout the work, because the horse can keep its back up. As you will feel with young horses as you go along with this one, she'll start to drop her back. And that's when you have to be a good enough rider to feel that and send the horse back into the stretch again to refresh those muscles. Remember, every time we stretch, the muscle relax, we bring blood into the muscle, and it sort of reinvigorates itself, if you will. So as the horse gets more developed, the stretches become fewer and fewer, but are always part of good training with any horse. And any horse should have days when that's all they do is come out and just have some days when they stretch. For instance, if you've taken a horse to a horse show, you've had a particularly hard day the day before, you come out and do nothing but stretch with the horse. It's like, you know, no athlete can work at the highest level every day. They would simply destroy themselves. Well, the same is true of horses, but we see so many people expecting horses to do this, to come out and go day after day after day at the highest level, doing nothing but the tricks. When I see so many people ride today, these upper level riders, they're just going from trick to trick to trick, you know, trying to do these impressive things and never giving the horse a break in between. Really nice into that stretch here. And once again, notice how nice, at least she's swinging underneath herself. And once again, this is just coming. She hasn't really started to lift herself a lot, but at least we're getting a good and consistent working gait. Right there, she gets to a really good place. Now, this would have been completely impossible even just a month or so ago. So this is the first day that she's had this level of connection. Really nice, coming to a really nice place there. So we're doing some serpentines and figure eights here. Notice there isn't any big change. Sandra's able to get her back into the working gait. There's always in the beginning, when they're just coming to the stage, a little difficulty when you're changing the bend. But even that's starting to happen pretty nicely here for her. Doing a little lengthening the stride here, just going straight and opening the stride a little bit. Not a great deal. Remember, the first things, before we work on transitions between the gaits, we work on transitions within the gaits. So we never really work on that much of transitions, you know, between the gaits in the beginning, because the horse is bound to just kind of fall apart. So when we're starting to work transitions, they're first within the gait, just asking for a little bit of lengthening and then coming back again, a little bit of lengthening, coming back again. So the horse gets used to changing the gaits a little bit. The transitions between the gaits, if we have done everything right, just kind of come around all by themselves. The more you work on them, the more you keep the horse going at the horse time and time and time again, the horse just gets frustrated. And whenever you feel that frustration, instead of trying to whip the horse through that frustration, your frustration, you come back to a stretch, understanding that most resistance has its origins in physical inability. When horses understand what they can do and they've got the strength on a given day to do what you're asking them to do, they're happy to do it in most cases because it isn't hurting them. They're not afraid of it. It feels good. That's the point of working out. You know, should make a person or a horse feel better. And really nice into a working trot there. That's how nicely she's keeping that neck up. Once again, a couple of months ago, that would have been impossible. And you can see Sandra working a little bit with the inside rein, just trying to keep her soft. But once again, there was no big change in her trot. She didn't disengage. Really nice stretch in the trot again here. And of course, as we go on, we want to go longer, then we might want to keep this little stretch breaks a little bit longer. So again, this is the most consistent this horse has ever worked. This is a big step. And sitting to the trot there, notice there wasn't any big change in her trot. She didn't just die out from underneath there or come to a stop. The legs didn't stop moving. And back into a rising trot again. Sandra is doing a wonderful job with all the horses that she is working. Here we do a little bit of lengthening stride in this direction. Not trying to get the biggest thing again, just to get a little bit more swing through her back. So again, working transitions within the gaits. Now, when we began this horse, also, even the lunge line, this horse really couldn't canter. She was so disconnected, and you'd put her into a canter, and it would put her into a panic. So we really have only cantered her a handful of times under saddle, or even attempted it. But we're getting to the point where even that now is possible. Notice how nice and relaxed the underside of her neck is here and all of this once again. Good working trot there, really getting to a really lovely place right there. Excellent. So that was really nice. And coming back to a big stretch again. We could not be happier with the way this horse is developing. Sandra has done a wonderful job with her. It's really all about patience. You cannot lose your patience with this kind of a horse. If you're training hot horses that have some life in them, they just won't accept being trained in that way of being forced into everything. I grew up riding thoroughbreds in Kentucky, and I learned right away that, people, if you try to do the things that people do to other kinds of horses, warm bloods, and some of these, and of course, in Kentucky, we saw Tennessee Walkers and saddlebreds and all these kinds of things, and the horrible things being done to them. And those are such nice, lovely horses. If you tried to do that with a thoroughbred, it would kill you. So really happy with what Sandra's done here. The first day, really a pretty consistent working trot. Great work. I hope that inspires you all to do the same with yours. Thanks for listening. This is Will Faber from Art to Ride.